Good evening, everyone. So we have a nice variety of questions this month. One of them, I think, came from one of y'all's neighbors or friends or coworkers, perhaps. And two of them came from the kids, and they were all submitted in the box back there. And I absolutely love it. Keep submitting questions. So now we'll see as we go along if y'all can figure out who asked what. Our first question: when Jesus was near Pontius Pilate, Pilate said he found no fault with him. So why did the Roman soldiers not obey Pilate's command? Now, if I understand the question correctly, the question is based on a misreading of the gospel text, or a misunderstanding of what's going on at the trial of Jesus. It misreads two things about what happens with Jesus before Pilate. The first is who Pilate's audience is whenever he says that he finds no fault in Jesus. The second thing that it misreads is Pilate's intent in declaring, I find no fault with this man. So in other words, what he expected to come of his statement. So let's go to Luke chapter 23. And we can consider this really from any of the Gospels. But Luke lays it out in a threefold pattern that I think is really easy to follow. Luke chapter 23. And again, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the idea is that according to this reading of the crucifixion narrative, that whenever Pilate says, I find no fault with this man, he is, in essence, declaring to the soldiers that he releases Jesus and that he, again, doesn't intend to do anything to him, and the soldiers should let him go, but that the soldiers, for some reason, choose to disobey him and crucify him anyway. As we read through the gospel account, we'll see that that is not the case. We'll start in verse 1, Luke chapter 23. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, You have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they were urgent, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. All right, this is the first time that we see Pilate utter this phrase, I find no guilt in this man. Who's the audience? Who's Pilate speaking to? Yeah, the Jews, the chief priests and the crowds who were there before Pilate. He says, I find no guilt in this man. So what's his intent in saying this? It's not that he's giving orders, right? Because, again, he's governor of the region, but he's not like direct commander over these guys. What he's trying to do, well, we'll see over the course of the chapter, if we can discern what Pilate is trying to do. Verse 6, when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, You brought me this man as one who is misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him. All right, so now for a second time, Pilate has declared that he finds no guilt in Jesus, and he declares his intent to punish and release Jesus. And again, who's the audience? It's the chief priests, the scribes, the rulers rather, and the people. All right, it's not the soldiers. Verse 18. But they all cried out together, "Away with this man! Release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I'll therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And so again, who's the audience? It's the same audience that we've had the other two times. The chief priests, the rulers, and the crowds. So, the guards, the soldiers, have nothing to do with this at this point. He's not addressing them at all. Now, why does Pilate keep saying, "I find no fault with him, there's no guilt in him deserving of death, I'm going to punish him and release him"? Do we get the sense that Pilate is fully in control of this situation? Especially not in this last circumstance. All right, Pilate addressed them once more, verse 20, desiring to release Jesus. Well, if he desired to release Jesus, why didn't he just release Jesus? Luke doesn't go real deep into the politics of it. We'll look in one of the other Gospels in just a moment. But Pilate does not hold all of the cards here. Pilate is not fully within his power to release Jesus for reasons that Luke doesn't state here. And his desire is thwarted. They kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." And he appeals to them that third time. And then verse 23, but they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So this is not a matter of an order. Whenever Pilate declares, "I find no fault with him," he's not giving anybody an order. He's trying to persuade. Right? He wants the chief priests and the crowds to drop the charges and to be satisfied with a flogging. Right? Because whenever he says, "I'll punish him and release him," it's not like in the U.S., ideally, right? Ideally, today in our country, if you are arrested over some kind of misunderstanding or something, what's the worst that you expect to have happen at the hands of the government? Right? Normally, maybe you spend a night in jail. Things get cleared up. You get let go. What do you think would happen if, as part of regular procedure here in the United States, the police just automatically beat you as part of your release, regardless of what's going on? They haven't even brought charges against you. Right? Or any charges that were brought against you have been dropped. You're free to go, but we're going to beat you. Right? We would all rightfully lose our minds. That's just not the way that law works in the U.S. In the ancient world, it worked that way because it doesn't really matter whether you were guilty or innocent. You are causing the authorities trouble, and they are going to get something out of you for it. And so whenever Pilate says, "I will punish and release him," he's talking about a flogging, right? Let's satisfy all parties here. I don't want to crucify this guy. I don't want to kill this guy. But obviously you guys want something, so essentially let's make a deal, right? You get some blood out of this. You get a bit of a spectacle. You get to see this guy get beat up, but I don't want to kill him. But his attempt at persuading them does not work. And in the end, who decides to crucify? At least, who does Luke say ultimately makes this decision? It says that Pilate made it, ultimately, but He does it at the behest of the crowd, right? Yeah, so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted, right? He accedes to the crowd. Now, all of the gospel writers depict the crucifixion in this way. Whether you go to Matthew, Mark, or John, they're going to tell essentially the same story. The framing and some of the details might be a little different. But this is, in every gospel, this is a matter of Pilate trying to convince the chief priests, the rulers, and the crowds to drop the charges, let this go, just be satisfied with a good beating, let's all go home. The guards aren't part of the decision-making process at all. They only come in at the very end to actually execute the sentence. Once Pilate has pulled the trigger, as it were, and said, we're going to execute him, then the soldiers step in, take him, and crucify him. So, now, why did Pilate submit to the will of the crowds? Why does Luke present Pilate as essentially powerless in this circumstance? The short answer to this is in Mark 15:15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. In other words, Pilate is playing politics with this because he has a region to govern. And if there's a riot in Jerusalem, he's probably going to lose his position. And for Pilate, this is, you got to understand, in the Roman Empire, Palestine is a backwater. Right? If you are working a government job, as it were, in Palestine, that's like, I don't know, that's like working in government and getting assigned to northern Alaska or something, against your will, right? Not at your request. They just say, oh, we're going to ship you off to Antarctica or Alaska. I won't insult anybody else's state. I thought about it. Held my tongue. Palestine is essentially that way. And so Pilate he's a high-ranking government official, but again, this is not a great position. And if he loses this, which is what happens to governors whenever they can't keep the peace in their regions in the Roman Empire, if he loses this, there's really nowhere for him to get demoted to. Right? It's not that he's going to take a governorship in some other region of the empire. It's that, either he is just out on his ear, or he is possibly demoted and stuck in Palestine, now no longer as governor, but as some lackey. All right? So Pilate is doing everything that he can to keep the peace. He wishes to satisfy the crowd. Matthew, in his account, tells us that the crowds were starting to riot. Right, so again, that is the last thing on earth that the Romans want, is for a riot. So, he is saving his rear end. So that's why this has nothing to do with the Roman soldiers disobeying a command from Pilate. I feel like that was a pretty straightforward one. Any questions or comments on that before we move on to the next one? Ultimately, and in Matthew's account, remember what he does. He makes this public act of washing his hands in front of the people. And he says, the blood be on your heads. And remember, the audience, or the crowd says, yes, his blood be on us and on our children. Right? So he doesn't want it, he doesn't want to take the blame for it. He doesn't want to be responsible for it. And he, at least publicly, succeeds at it. Having the dreams. I think so. I mean, when you look at him, in that circumstance, you look at him in John, he's clearly frightened of this situation, right? He's frightened of what his wife tells him. He's frightened of his own encounter with Jesus. He's got enough sense to know that he doesn't really want any part in this. But he is kind of between a rock and a hard place here. I don't want us to come away from this feeling sorry for poor, pitiful Pilate, right? Because he ultimately pulls the trigger. He makes the choice. But we should recognize he's in a difficult situation. And that's why he engages in all these attempts to persuade, instead of just saying flat out, no, we're not doing this. So, Excellent observations. Let's pass on to our second question. Who was older, Caleb or Joshua? This was a fun question. The short answer is that we don't know for sure. Because the way that we date people in the Bible, the way that we figure out when they lived relative to when others lived in the Bible, is by determining their time of death, like the date of their death, and calculating backwards based on their age and other date markers that occurred during their lives. Now, that leaves us in a difficult situation with Joshua and Caleb, because we don't know as much about them as you think we would, right? Because these are the two faithful spies, right? At least one of them's got a great name. And these, one of them is Moses' successor. You would think we would have a lot of details about them. We've got some gaps in terms of what the biblical record provides for us. Turn to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24. In verse 29, we know Joshua's age at his death. After these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. All right, but here's the hard part with Joshua. We do not know how long he ruled between the death of Moses and his own death, because the rest of the book of Joshua does not keep track of the passage of time in a regular enough manner for us to do any kind of meaningful math about it. So you'll hear all kind of ranges for his rule, anywhere from like 25 years up to close to 60 years. There's a huge range that it could be. We know that there has to be a 300-year period in between the time that Israel defeats King Sihon of Heshbon and the time that Jephthah fights the Ammonites, because Jephthah brings it up, assuming he even knows his history properly. Who knows? Jephthah could just be pulling that out of his, out of thin air. But we don't know all of the details in terms of between Moses' death and Joshua's death. Now, with Caleb, the situation is the other way around. We know some important dates from the middle of his life. So, for example, go to Joshua 14. I did not know this before studying this question, so thank you, you who asked this question. Joshua chapter 14, verse 6. In Joshua 14, this is when the inheritance starts to be divided out among the tribes. All right, Judah is about to receive their inheritance. Then the people of Judah, this is Joshua 14, verse 6. Joshua 14, 6. Then the people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal. And Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word again, as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. I'm still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said. That's pretty epic. Now, first off, we get a lot of details here. All right, and it's almost like Caleb is aware that he is that this is going to be recorded for posterity, and he wants everybody to know. I was 40 years old, he makes sure that we know, whenever the spies were sent out to spy. Now, first off, think of that. Imagine going out to spy out an enemy country at age 40. Right? I don't know if any of y'all had ever imagined how old Caleb and Joshua were whenever they went out to spy. But now we know Caleb at least was 40. And at this point, he's 85. And he says, I'm just as strong now as I was then. How many of us are in that boat? I'm as fit at 85 as I was at 40. And I'm going to show you, because I want to inherit this land that is full of fortified cities and strong warriors, so I can show y'all how I'm going to kick their rear ends. Right? That is what Caleb declares at the age of 85. Pretty cool stuff. Now, Caleb pops up again another couple of times. There's a point later in Joshua, and it is mirrored again at the beginning of Judges. So it's the same story told twice over, about how he gets his son-in-law. It's basically, there's one of these fortified cities he's trying to take, and he offers his daughter in marriage to whoever will take this city for him. But that's one of the last things that we hear of Caleb the son of Jephunneh. We do not receive any death notice of Caleb. He just kind of disappears from the biblical record at this point. We have no idea how old he was when he died relative to Joshua. So, we've got Joshua's age at death. We've got Caleb's age at a couple of points in Israel's history, during the spying out of the land and the receiving of the inheritance. The problem with the receiving of the inheritance is, again, we don't know exactly at what point in Joshua's rule this happened. Right? Like how much time passes between now and Joshua's death so that we could date Joshua's age at this point. The closest thing that we have to an answer to this comes from Numbers 14. But I tell you, reading Joshua 14, it's encouraging to know that my best days may be ahead of me. All right, Numbers chapter 14. And this is, of course, the time that Israel rebels. All right, this is, in Numbers 13, the spies are sent out. We know at this point that Caleb is 40 years old. After Israel decides they're not going to go into the promised land, remember the Lord says that he's going to destroy them. Moses intercedes. And so the Lord listens to Moses. And let's pick up with that in Numbers chapter 14, verse 20. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. But truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And none of those who despised me shall see it. All right, now we need to pay close attention to the text here, because this contains something that we're familiar with, but it's presented in a way that we don't often talk about it. All right, what's the judgment of the Lord here? They're all gonna die. On what basis? In other words, how is he going to decide who lives and who dies, based on what we just read? Okay, and Peggy, what did you say? Okay, because they were unfaithful, they're going to die, and the ones that he's chosen are, say it again, Wayne? The ones who saw the glory of the Lord in Egypt. Now, what do we typically talk about when it comes to like who the Lord decides is going to die in the wilderness? What's the normal standard that we cite for who's going to die in the wilderness? All of them over 20 at a certain point. All right? Now, and I honestly didn't bring this out in this, well, it was something that I missed as I was reading it when we were studying through this section. The Lord presents Moses with two different criteria for who he's going to destroy. Now, they amount ultimately to the same thing, but he says it two different ways. All right, the first one, which we just read, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness and yet have put me to the test shall see the land that I swore to give their fathers. All right, that's the standard. Those that were around to see what I did in Egypt. Now, who's exempted from this? Verse 24, but my servant Caleb, because he had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. All right, now, this is, I personally consider this to be kind of shaky. All right? But I want us to consider what the text says. Caleb is the one who's exempted on this basis. Joshua is not exempted on this basis. Is there anything that we've just learned about Joshua? Possibly. At the time that they were in Egypt, he might have been under 20, right? Because that is, to use a, well, no, that's their age of accountability, as it were, right? That is what the census declares as the coming of age, is 20 years and up. And that's brought up in the next criterion, the next condemnation that the Lord levies against Israel. Go down to verse 28. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward who had grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell. All right, this is a different criterion. Those of you that were 20 years old and upward from the time of the census. All right, the census he's referring to is the one that's taken at the beginning of Numbers, and that happens during the second year that they are in the wilderness. All right, so 2 years have passed, or a year and a half has passed since the Exodus started. And he says if they're 20 and up from that point, the taking of the census, not one of them shall come into the land that I swore to make you dwell, except, and in this case, who's exempted? Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. Now, this is not something I came up with on my own. This is something that was suggested by somebody that I read. That again, we're looking at two different criteria here. One of them covers only Caleb and not Joshua. The other covers Caleb and Joshua, telling us that when Israel was in Egypt, Joshua was under 20. 2 years later, or a year and a half later, however much time had passed, Joshua was over 20 because he was counted in the census. And Caleb is how old? Now, we know that for a fact. Caleb is 40. There is a possibility, and again, I consider this to be, I'm on the fence about this. But this is the closest that we have to an answer to that question. There is a possibility that Caleb is a good 20 years older than Joshua. So, that's what I've got on that. Any questions or comments about this matter of dating Caleb or Joshua? Okay. That was a fun question to research, so thank you for that question. Yes. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be possible. Mm-hmm. let's see, where are we looking at specifically? When he's selecting them? Let's see. Yes. Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I'm giving the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers, you shall send a man, every one a chief among them. If I remember right, let me look it up real quick. 13:2. That might just be the generic word for leader. Like, not necessarily like head of the whole tribe. Yeah. At this stage, I need to think about that, see if I can think of any other examples of guys that at that age would achieve that position. The counter evidence to that, right, he's selected, so the question is, at age 20, would he have attained to that kind of position to be chosen for such a thing? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Now, he's clearly an exceptional guy. The thing that leads me to think that he is pretty young, like maybe not 20, but is that in Exodus 33, whenever he helps Moses up the mountain, he is referred to as a na'ar, a young man, which is not just an indicator of age, it's also an indicator of status, right? Which means essentially he's not attained full manhood yet at that point, and they're already in the wilderness. Like, the census hasn't been taken yet. Yeah, he's already Moses' right-hand man. Like, Joseph is referred to as a na'ar when he's 17. And of course, he also attains to pretty high positions at young ages too. Right? I think he's, 30, maybe 30 whenever he enters Pharaoh's court? Which again, Joshua being 20 is really impressive at this point. So, I don't know, I would need to mull that one over. Again, I consider that case to be, I'm not dedicated to it at all. But that is the closest thing I can find to an answer on that. Wayne? Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not saying that kind of gives me something of a special angle, and he had a special relationship with. So it mentions here that he called this guy a special name. So I'm thinking that there's something added in there that perhaps we don't know. We're not told.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me find it here. So I've done Joshua. Possibly. I mean, at the very least, we've got some sense that Joshua is special to Moses, which we know that from, again, his assisting role in Exodus 33. So. Mm-hmm. Possibly. Okay. Well, I tell you what, it is late enough, and this final question is big enough that I'm not going to keep you all till 8 o'clock. But I'll give you a preview for next month. This I consider to be a perceptive question. And I'll just go ahead and spoil it. It was one of the kids that asked this question. Was Mary a prophetess? That's the question that we're going to consider. That's one of the questions we're going to consider next month. The mother of Jesus. Yeah, Mary, the mother of Jesus. I don't know if I should hit you with a spoiler answer and let you wonder like how I arrived at that, or because it might surprise you what I think on this. We'll just leave it for next month. We'll leave it for next month. So thank you so much for the good questions, for the excellent questions and comments here in the class in discussing these things. And I'm trying to think of a good tie-in here for an invitation, but I can't think of one. So I'm going to launch right into it. Anytime that we get together, we invite anyone who is here to obey the Lord's command, obey the gospel call, to repent of our sins, to confess Jesus as Lord, and to be baptized into his death, burial, and resurrection. If there are any who are in need of that, we invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing.